Hi, I'm William West, author of Riddles of the Shroud, Questions Science Can't Answer. Mention the Shroud and many people will say, didn't carbon dating prove that Shroud thing was a medieval fake? The problem is most of us know little about the Shroud and even less about carbon dating. So let's look at the facts that have helped make the Shroud the most researched artifact in human history. Keep in mind, belief in the Shroud is not about faith, but about facts. So this is the Shroud, a typical burial cloth about 1 metre wide and 4 metres long. The dark diamond shapes are burns from a fire in 1532. The faint images behind them are images of a man front and back covered in real blood. This is how the image was formed. The body was placed on one end of the Shroud, which was wound over the head and down the front. The first riddle is that the blood was on the cloth first, before the image, because scientists have shown there's no image under the blood. Putting blood on before the image is the opposite of what any artist would or could do. So how did the image get there? Most Shroud researchers are now convinced it could only have come from a burst of light, that is, a burst of electromagnetic radiation. To understand this, it helps to know something about linen cloth. Take the typical linen thread on the left. It's made from incredibly tiny microfibers. Each one is 1/5 the width of an average human hair, like the one on the right, barely visible even in bright light. This is how the microfibers look magnified 64 times. The big rectangles are linen threads and the tiny filaments are microfibers. The whole image comes from a layer of these discolored microfibers. There is no paint, pigment, ink or dye on them. In a single stroke, this fact removes any possibility that the Shroud images were made by a human hand or by the hand of nature. If they were, more than the surface fibers on the cloth would be affected. If any fluid or gas was involved, it would penetrate much deeper into the microscopic fibers. The only way scientists have been able to reproduce the discolored fibers is with a burst of ultraviolet light from excimer lasers. They'd calculated that to discolor the whole image area would require 34 trillion watts of electricity in a split second, and that's simply not possible, even today. If it were a forgery, one of the most puzzling things about the Shroud would be the fact that the front and back images are so incredibly faint. To even see them, you need to stand 1 metre or 2 back. Any closer or further back and the images simply fade away. Even if a forger could create an image like this, why do it? For a forgery that was meant to be displayed before large crowds. And how could an artist do it? All artists vary the pressure they use to apply paint or any other medium. No artist could create such an extensive layer of discolored microfibers so that it was perfectly uniform, a fraction of a human hair deep. It's simply not possible. Now, if you ask most people what this image is, they would say the face on the Shroud of Turin, but in fact, it isn't. This is the face on the Shroud. Doesn't look like much, just a blurry smudge. The major blood flows, like a prominent one on the forehead, are clear, but little else is. If you look at the eye sockets in this close-up, they seem almost empty, making the face look like a skull with hair and a beard. Then in 1898, a photographer took the first photo of the Shroud and, looking at the negative, became the first person ever to see this now familiar image, a high-resolution photographic positive image that revealed the Shroud was a photographic negative with lights and darks reversed many centuries before photography was even thought of. The image sent shockwaves around the world. People suddenly realized the Shroud was not a blurry smudge at all, but a photographic image. Look at the eyes now. The sockets are not empty at all. The details are clear. The right eye line here is well defined and straight, but the left eye line is broken. And the reason is there's a huge swelling pushing up against the eyelids. Forensic pathologists have also identified a swelling on the opposite cheek and swollen cartilage on the bridge of the nose here. Skeptics rightly said the negative image was impossible. They claimed that the photographer Secondo Pia had faked up the photo. But when another photographer did the same thing in front of witnesses, skeptics changed tack. They said it was no big deal after all, science would work it out. After 125 years, we're still waiting. Taken by itself, the high-resolution negative photographic image we see today is still inexplicable, and no artist has ever produced anything like it, certainly not by discolouring microscopic fibres. Then scientists discovered one more impossible feature of the shroud image. Unlike any photograph, it had three-dimensional properties. Scientists made the discovery when they scanned the image into a computer called the VP8 Image Analyzer, pictured here, and it is now confirmed by digital photography as well. The discovery revealed the shroud image is encoded with computer-readable 3D information, with each detail of the image recording the distance between the body and the cloth. And this is the man who created the VP8 Image Analyzer, engineer Peter Schumacher. Decades after he first came across the shroud, he's still impressed. As he said in one interview, "The shroud is a unique image, the only one of its kind in the whole world. Nothing else like it. Three-dimensional relief of the front and of the back of a whole human being. Only one in the world. No other, nowhere, no how, no way. I don't know any way to make it. I never heard of any way to make it, just the Shroud of Turin." Schumacher adds that when he came across the shroud, he wasn't very religious, but like many shroud researchers, including some agnostics and atheists, he underwent a conversion. He is now a Catholic deacon. The 3D qualities of the shroud are so clear they have inspired scientists to create statues. This bronze statue is on permanent display at Jerusalem's Notre Dame Centre. Notice the detail of the abrasions on the knees and the detail of the face, and you'll find links of a number of statues engineered by scientists in the notes. So now we have three impossible features. First, the image is made from a uniform layer of microscopic linen fibres. Second, it's a high-resolution photographic negative. And third, it's 3D. Rest assured, no forger, medieval or otherwise, could have done this. And there is now plenty of historical evidence, both from writings and from images, that the shroud was around long before the Middle Ages. We'll focus on the images because the evidence is so graphic, and they take us right back to the earliest centuries of Christianity. First stop, the 1100s, over a century before the carbon date of 1325. These images are from the illuminated Pray manuscript, dated to the 1190s. It features drawings with many details unique to the shroud. We'll look at just 6 of them. First, Jesus is shown naked, something that was taboo in medieval art. Second, the arms are crossed at the wrists. Third, as on the shroud, there are no visible thumbs. Fourth, there's a prominent mark on the forehead, in the same position as the one on the shroud. 5. The cloth has 4 burn holes in an L shape that match well-known burn holes on the shroud, pictured on the right. And finally, the cloth has an obvious herringbone pattern zigzagging all over it. The artist has made sure it can't be missed. Second stop, the 7th century, and stretching right back to the 1st. This cloth is the Sudarium of Oviedo, the face cloth believed to be the one mentioned in St. John's Gospel, used to cover Jesus' face from Calvary to Gethsemane. It was kept in Jerusalem until the early 600s, when it was moved to Oviedo in Spain. There is no image because the cloth was removed before the body was placed on the shroud. But the Sudarium does have microscopic flower pollens from Jerusalem that are found on the shroud, and microscopic traces of a rare travertine limestone from Jerusalem also found on the shroud. And most impressive of all, the shape of bloodstains on the Sudarium matches the shape of the bloodstains on the shroud. In the notes, you'll find a link to a video demonstrating the matching bloodstains. Historical evidence also includes images of Jesus' face on Byzantine coins. An overlay study with this coin, a golden solidus from 692, established a match of more than 99%. Look at the eyes, the way the artist has created large round eyeballs to fill the big empty eye sockets. And note the similar shape of the nose, hair and beard. And there are many similar Byzantine coins catalogued in books and academic journal articles. Then there are the famous Byzantine icons of Jesus. This one is from the 500s. An image overlay reveals 150 points of congruence, enough to establish in a court of law that the faces match. Now, historical evidence from the linen cloth itself. 3 qualities of the cloth dated to the 1st century: its herringbone pattern, its primitive weave, and unique stitching that runs down one side of the cloth have all been dated to the 1st century. So that's a glimpse of the historical evidence. Now the body images. They reveal accurate forensic detail unknown in the Middle Ages, things science has now confirmed that no one knew before the shroud came along. The sketch on the right highlights key details like the scourge marks. We've already examined the face, so we'll go straight to the front of the body. First, note scourge marks cover the whole body, not just the back, as artists had thought. There is even one stray scourge mark on the right cheek. Forensic pathologists confirm every single mark, every blood flow and blood clot is 100% accurate, unlike the embarrassing efforts of medieval artists and of modern skeptics. Chemists have confirmed that the blood is real blood, and like the image, it has no brush marks or traces of any artistic materials. Most of the scourge marks are shaped like small dumbbells, matching a Roman scourge called the flagrum, and the rest match 2 other Roman whips, the virgae and the Spanish cords. Keep in mind, in the Middle Ages, Roman crucifixions had been banned for 1,000 years, and there were no museums or archaeologists around to carry out research. The scourge marks on the chest would have caused severe damage in the chest cavity and a build-up of clear serous fluid around the heart and lungs. Scientists have discovered the blood has high levels of the blood chemical bilirubin, consistent with someone who had suffered extreme torture. This fact alone underlines authenticity. What can't be seen with the naked eye are the blood serum rings surrounding the blood marks. They were discovered when modern scientists exposed the shroud to ultraviolet light, causing the serum rings to fluoresce. Arrow 1 points to chest muscles that are raised and rigid, revealing a long struggle to breathe. Arrow 2 points to a huge blood flow from a wound between the 5th and 6th ribs in the shape of a Roman lancia. This close-up of the chest wound reveals both blood and a clear fluid like that described in the Gospels as water. It is in fact serous fluid that would have come from around the right lung and the heart, something first identified when the fluid fluoresced under ultraviolet light. Moving down, arrows 3 and 4 point to the arms, and the arms reveal 2 flows of blood consistent with someone pushing up and then slumping back down in a struggle to breathe. A little further down is a wrist wound indicating nails passed through the wrists rather than the palms of the hands, as artists had assumed. Experiments confirmed nails in the palms would have torn right through the hands. To support the weight of a body, they had to pass through the wrists, as the shroud shows. Also, notice no thumbs are visible. Pathologists say nails through the wrists would have cut into the median nerves, forcing the thumbs inwards and out of sight. Pathologists also note that nails through the median nerves would have sent lightning bolts of pain up the arms with every movement, an unimaginable torture. Moving down to arrows 6 and 7, the knees show deep abrasions consistent with a series of falls, and the legs are bent stiff, revealing one more surprising detail, rigor mortis, which also explains the appearance of stiffness in other parts of the body. Finally, on the frontal view, arrow 8 points to a wound in the right foot. This close-up shows blood flowing across the cloth from the foot wound, indicating the body was still bleeding when the shroud was placed on it. Pathologists have confirmed that blood is able to seep from a dead body. Moving to the back view, arrow 1 points to blood flows all over the head, consistent with a mass of thorns covering the entire scalp. The image on the left illustrates a crown matching the scalp wounds. The thorns would have pierced the cranial nerves among the most sensitive in the human body, causing overwhelming pain. This crown of thorns contrasts with the neat little circlet favoured by artists. Researchers agree the shroud's unruly mass of thorns is far more likely, pointing out that weaving the circlet would have caused the weaver's hands to be repeatedly stabbed by thorns. Arrows 2 and 3 point to 2 patches of abrasions on the shoulder blades. These patches are consistent with the rubbing of a heavy beam of wood against the flesh, something any artist would have struggled to depict convincingly, particularly with nothing more to work with than discoloured fibres and blood, and avoiding leaving any brush marks behind. The back is also covered by dumbbell-shaped scourge marks. The marks on each side of the back have different angles, revealing 2 scourges, one taller than the other. Arrow 4 points to a network of blood flows across the lower back. This blood has clearly come from the chest wound on the front. No artist had ever conceived of this trail of blood down the side and across the lower back. Pathologists say it makes sense and it's accurate. Arrow 5 points to the left foot, which is pressed flat against the cloth, while the left knee is bent, confirming rigor mortis. Blood also flows across the cloth from the left foot. On the feet, researchers have discovered, mixed with the blood, microscopic traces of soil with that extremely rare travertine limestone from Jerusalem and the Siderium of Oviedo. Clearly a compelling detail. This same soil was found on the knees and on the nose, revealing the man on the shroud fell not only on his knees, as artists had depicted, but on his face as well. In addition to all this, traces of flower pollen have been found, revealing a journey from Jerusalem through Eastern Europe to the West. So now, after reviewing so much evidence indicating the shroud was around long before the Middle Ages and that it could not have been faked up by a medieval forger, we finally come to the carbon dating. Many shroud researchers have written on the subject, including the author of this book, Joseph G. Marino, who argues the dating error was likely to be due to a medieval repair of the shroud. On the book's cover, we see 3 men who claimed in 1988 that the carbon dating proved the shroud was a medieval forgery. The gentleman on the left is Professor Teddy Hall. He made 3 claims: that the shroud was part of a multi-million-pound business in making forgeries, that someone just got a bit of linen and they just faked it up and flogged it. Sounds so easy, doesn't it? Was the shroud really part of a multi-million-pound trade in relics? In fact, it was unveiled in Western Europe not in a great cathedral, but in a little wooden church in a tiny, isolated French village called Liry, population 100. Not the sort of place where forgers would unveil the greatest relic the Western world had ever seen. When it was unveiled, the shroud was in the possession of a devoutly religious knight, Geoffrey de Charnay, shown here. By all accounts, not someone who would get involved in forging relics. Importantly, it seems his forebears had taken part in the Fourth Crusade, which in 1204 invaded Constantinople and took possession of its relics, including its most prized possession, a cloth described as carrying an image of Jesus in death. And did some forger in the Middle Ages really just get a bit of this linen? There was nothing like it in the Middle Ages. For a start, there's its 1st century herringbone patent. The Great British Museum searched the world for a sample from the Middle Ages to use as a control sample for the carbon dating, and nothing could be found. The only known sample of the herringbone weave is from the 1st century. Then there's the primitive quality of the weave and its first century stitching. So in medieval Europe, no forger could have just got a piece of this linen. And finally, did a medieval forger just fake up the shroud and its image? Back in 1988, modern scientists had been trying to fake it up for 90 years. No one had gotten close, and they still haven't. And what about the other two carbon daters? In the middle is the man who was in charge of the project, Dr. Michael Tite from the British Museum. In recent times, he's revealed in an interview that the man on the shroud is not a fake at all. He believes the shroud contained a real crucified body. In other words, the shroud was not faked up by a medieval forger at all. This, of course, was a huge admission. The man on the right is Dr. Robert Hedges. He confirmed at the time of the carbon dating that the carbon daters knew the medieval carbon date could have been caused by contamination, specifically from a burst of radiation, but they just said radiation doesn't come from a dead body. Of course, that is normally the case, but in this case, the evidence indicates otherwise. It's important to keep in mind here that carbon dates have often been wrong, sometimes by thousands of years. The main reason is contamination, and the shroud is more likely to be contaminated than just about any artifact in history. Against this background, a protocol drawn up by a panel of scientists before the carbon dating insisted 7 samples needed to be taken from at least 3 different areas of the cloth. But in the event, only 1 sample was taken from 1 area and divided into 3. It came from one of the worst possible areas of the cloth that had been handled countless times, and there is evidence that it may have even been repaired in the Middle Ages. Then, after the carbon dating, the raw data was kept under lock and key for 29 years. A Freedom of Information action finally led to the release of the raw data in 2017. 4 research papers authored by a total of 12 experts have now been published in peer-reviewed journals, all concluding the carbon dating was flawed. As we've seen, the carbon daters were aware at the time of the carbon dating that electromagnetic radiation was capable of raising carbon-14 levels on the cloth. But they argued that dead bodies don't emit radiation. But of course, the evidence in this case indicates radiation did come from this dead body. Confirmation that the carbon date is wrong includes historical evidence that, as we've seen, goes back to the early centuries of Christianity. There's also the 3 ancient features of the linen cloth itself that place it in the 1st century. And now, new dating techniques have also dated shroud samples to the 1st century. 3 separate tests carried out by engineering measurements expert Professor Giulio Fanti and colleagues at the University of Padua produced dates consistent with the 1st century. Then, just last year, a team headed by senior academic Dr. Liberato De Caro from Italy's National Research Council also dated the shroud to the 1st century. They used a technique called wide-angle X-ray scattering. The findings were published in the international peer-reviewed science journal Heritage, but were not reported at all by most of the media. So to sum up the evidence we've looked at, we've seen that the shroud image has many impossible features that couldn't be created by a forger, including its uniform microscopic image, its high-resolution photonegative qualities, and its 3D features. We've seen the medical accuracy of every aspect of the image right down to the last trace of blood, the traces of Jerusalem soil and flower pollens. We've seen that the carbon dating was flawed, confirmed by historical evidence including coins, icons, the Pray manuscript, the Sudarium of Oviedo, and the primitive features of the cloth itself. And all of this is confirmed by the new tests that date it to the 1st century. So these days, if anyone asks me, do you really think that shroud thing is Jesus' burial cloth? I can only say, given the evidence, I can't imagine what else it could be. But could the shroud still be a forgery? Well, after 5 years of research, I can't think of anything less likely. Riddles of the Shroud lists 99 pieces of evidence confirming authenticity. and there's no longer any real evidence that the shroud is a forgery. Add to all this the fact that all the evidence we now have fits the shroud like pieces of a puzzle, and like all puzzles, this one only fits together one way. The scientific details are spelled out in Chapter 9 of Riddles of the Shroud, but in brief. The blood had to come first from a body inside the cloth, creating perfect wounds, blood flows and clots. Then came the photonegative image fitting the position of the bloodstains perfectly and recording the distance of each part of the body from the cloth, creating the 3D effect. At the same time, the body had to be removed in a way that didn't disturb the blood flows and clots, a physical impossibility unless the body simply dematerialized, an event that appears to have coincided with a burst of light that created the image on the cloth. Hard to imagine? Of course, but that is what the material evidence indicates, and no one has ever come up with an alternative that fits all the facts. In 125 years of modern scientific research, not even close. The main conclusion from all of this takes the form of a question. How could any human being in or before the Middle Ages possibly create a high-resolution photographic negative 3D image formed from a uniform layer of discoloured microscopic linen fibres, perfectly matching the position of a huge network of genuine wounds, blood flows and clots, something countless modern scientists have been unable to achieve, and then plant on the cloth microscopic traces of soil and flower pollen from Jerusalem, the same soil and pollen found on the Sudarium of Oviedo that also shares the shape of the blood on the shroud, and then remove the body without damaging blood flows and clots. Taken together, these things are too much for most of us to hold in our heads at once, let alone for a primitive forger to envisage and execute. All this evidence surely constitutes a waterproof case, a wall of material evidence that should convince any well-instructed jury that the shroud is authentic. As I said at the outset, belief in the shroud is not a matter of faith, but of fact. Nevertheless, the shroud has led many people to faith and strengthened the faith of many more.